What's going on, SixPackAbs.com? It's Thomas DeLauer, your lead nutritionist and also the creator of Science-Based Six Pack, the intermittent fasting program. All right, so I've been catching a lot of flack lately from people wondering why I am big on high glycemic carbohydrates when it comes down to breaking a fast. You see, I'm known throughout the internet as sort of the low glycemic, low carb, ketogenic fasting guy. So people are like, wait a minute, Thomas, in your program you talk about utilizing higher glycemic carbs. What's up with that? Well, I thought that merited an explanation. You see, when it comes down to a fasting period, we become very insulin sensitive. Now, what insulin sensitivity is when your body's actual release of insulin is determined by how much food you eat. So if you are more insulin sensitive, for example, less carbohydrates are going to elicit more of an insulin response. If you're insulin resistant or you're not creating a whole lot of insulin, that means that you can consume a lot of carbohydrates and your insulin levels aren't going to change all that much. Now, we don't want to be insulin resistant. We want to be insulin sensitive. That's one of the main benefits of fasting. But what we also have to understand is what is truly happening when we are actually eliciting an insulin response. And if we can manipulate that right, we can have a lot of advantages when it comes down to how our body uses fuel. So let me give you an example. When you are fasting, your insulin levels are super sensitive. So when you break your fast, it would make sense that you would want to consume some kind of carbohydrates to elicit a little bit of an insulin response. The reason is it's going to allow you to absorb the food that is going along with the breaking of the fast. So for example, in my program, I talk about utilizing rice cakes now and then. Rice cakes, for example, are extremely high glycemic. And the reason is because normally you have a starch chain that's coming from a piece of rice. And that starch chain takes time to break down. You've got glucose molecules that are pressed together like this. If you visualize my hand as a starch chain and each one of my fingers as a glucose molecule, they're bound together in a starch chain like with rice. And when you swallow the rice and you start to break it down, you have to cleave them off one at a time. Break it down, break it down, break it down. And it's slowly digesting. But when you take rice and you put it through a puffing process, like creating puffed rice or creating a rice cake, you're injecting air into that starch. Poof. Now, instead of having a starch chain that you have to break apart glucose molecules from, you now have individual glucose molecules that are readily available. What that means is you have immediate glucose or close to it, which is going to cause an insulin spike to be really high. Now, we don't want to do this all the time, but if we do it strategically, it can make it so that the protein that you consume with that rice cake when you break your fast is utilized a lot better within the body. Okay, but now I have to talk about another thing that makes a lot of sense too, and that is controlling insulin, okay? Here's the problem with having low glycemic carbs all the time. Now, let me make sure that I preface this with the fact that I love low glycemic carbs, and when used properly, they are totally the way to go. But when it comes down to breaking your fast, it's a little bit different. We want to control the insulin spike. So if we have low glycemic carbs, it's like we have this constant bell curve that's slowly going up and slowly going down, and it's lasting a few hours. And then all of a sudden, we have more carbs, and that piles on top of that. So next thing, we never really have any dips in insulin. We have this constantly sort of moderately high level of insulin, which is okay because stable levels of insulin are good, but we don't want them stable and high. We want them stable and low. So what I like to do is strategically, of course, with the right supervision of a good program, make sure that you're having that spike in insulin and then a drop and then controlling you low. It's the only time I actually want you to spike your insulin properly. And that's why I always talk about breaking your fast with a very strategic meal, controlling the insulin spike, and then moving into the right kinds of foods. Because if we don't get a little bit of an insulin spike, it's hard to trigger the right kind of muscle growth that we also want to have when we're doing a fasting program. So you have your break fast meal, and then shortly thereafter, you have a more legitimate, well-rounded meal. The break fast meal is always going to be moderately high glycemic and very, very low fat. Remember, we don't want to have a high amount of fat coming in with high glycemic carbs because the insulin is going to allow the cell to become open and we don't want fat going in for the ride. So that's the other reason why we spike with a high glycemic carb. It's a shorter ride, it's a shorter duration. It allows us to eat a better, more delicious meal in a shorter amount of time versus having to wait for all of those carbs and that insulin to diminish. So for example, we have our carbs that spike our insulin high, and then an hour later, they're low again, which means we can consume food without having heightened levels of insulin, and we can go and keep our insulin levels nice and low. Don't worry, you're not gonna make yourself diabetic by having a couple of rice cakes when you break your fast. So it's pretty darn simple. How you break your fast is critical. How you break your fast is going to make or break the result of your intermittent fasting program. Now, I know there are a lot of different ways to skin a cat and a lot of different ways to eat, but I want to make sure that you have a solid understanding that insulin is not always the enemy. It just needs to be manipulated. We have to understand how our hormones work, how our bodies work, and of course, how digestion works. So as always, keep it locked in here on SixPackAbs.com. And of course, if you want to learn more, you can always hit the Science-Based Six-Pack program that is in the description below. But until then, I will see you in the next video.